David, are there signs that there's overloading or impending injury that athletes should be looking out for?
Like obviously if you're cranking up your training load and call it a really high ramp rate, your risk of injury goes up, and there's quite a lot of research across a lot of sports for that. If we ramp it up too quick, it tends to end in tears. If we ramp it up more gradually, you can get to a high level if you're patient, and that works.
Welcome to the Athlete's Compass podcast. Each week, renowned sports scientist and founder of Athletica AI, Dr. Paul Larson, athlete, coach, and sports scientist Mariana Rakai, and coach and cyclist Paul Worlowski discuss training, racing, and improving your health and fitness. Get ready for your journey to peak performance. Hello and welcome to the Athlete's Compass podcast, where we navigate training, fitness, and health for everyday athletes. As much as we try to stay injury-free, the reality is that many of us nurse injuries every year. Research is pretty clear on the positive effect of strength training preventing injuries, but today we want to focus on injury and pain management when the pesky injury is about to or has already sidelined us from doing what we love to do. Today's guest, physiotherapist David Wadsworth, is going to help us understand common overuse injuries in running, cycling, and triathlon, and how to manage injuries and especially pain when we are sidelined. David works as the head coach of Accelerate Performance Coaching, musculoskeletal and sports physiotherapist at Pain Solutions Queensland, and owner of Cycle Physio. David was Paul's guest at our sister podcast, the Training Science Podcast, and listen to that podcast as well. It's really informative. So, David, can you please introduce yourself and what made you immerse yourself in the worlds of physiotherapy and cycling and triathlon?
Well, I guess what got me out of high school and straight into physiotherapy, I actually was thinking of exercise physiology, and I lived in far north Queensland at the time, and my dad is a scientist, and he said, I think he was a bit worried I might not have a job to go to, and he said, if you're interested in sport, why don't you try sports physiotherapy? And that's what got me into it. And then throughout my career, I guess very early on, I did my honours thesis and got some help from a very good sports physio, worked with the Olympic swimming team. And so I got a lot of exposure to swimming early on, which is a bit unusual. Most of us do a lot of running sports. And then just through personal interest, got into cycling. And there was a bit of a niche there, a bit of an opportunity, and pursued that because it was an interest. So I'd had the three sort of individual sports of triathlon that have a big biomechanical sort of component. And I found that interesting. And that's why I kind of stuck with it.
That's awesome. In your LinkedIn profile, you wrote, I have pursued excellence in treating chronic pain whilst maintaining an interest in sports and human performance. So I am really interested in pain. So let's take a deep dive right into the deep side of the pool and talk about pain, specifically how pain is perceived in our central nervous system and brain.
All right. There's broadly speaking two types of pain. One's acute pain, which we're mostly familiar with. So think of a trauma. I sprained my ankle, I broke my leg, whatever it might be. We've done some structural damage and the body, there's inflammation, there's stimulation of the pain receptors, which our brain goes, or it's like putting your finger on a hot stove, you go, ouch, and it has a reaction, and it's a bit more predictable. We broke this bone. If we put it in a cast, we unload it, it's likely to take this long to heal. We're fairly familiar with that as a concept. Chronic pain's a bit different. Chronic pain, we don't necessarily have a structural damage like a broken bone that we can see. And this can be frustrating at times because most spinal pain doesn't have a label, the diagnostic label. 90 or more % of it is non-specific, meaning if we do an MRI, we're not getting a stress fracture or a disc blowout, but we still have pain. And so the model for approaching the diagnostics and the treatment needs to be different. If we apply an acute trauma model to a chronic pain model, it doesn't really work too well, and our results are quite poor. And so the way that we approach that is quite different.
And it's so frustrating because most of us experience that chronic pain, and sometimes the threaded label non-specific pops up when we go see experts, and then we walk away from the appointment and think like, is it all in my head? And then the frustration comes often because what it means to us. So even if our brain perceives the pain, that's okay. That's usually neutral, but it's the frustration and the painful emotions, anger, even it comes from what we like associate that pain with. Like a lot of athletes, okay, so now I have this issue that I have to deal with. What do I do with my race, for example? So how do you go about like talking to your patients and athletes about how to manage that, the emotions and the chronic pain?
That's that can be really tough because you're desperately wanting to do one thing, but your body is saying, "Hey, better cool our jets a little here. We've injured something, and it's not letting us do exactly what we want." And particularly if it's a really big goal that you've been working steadily and steadily towards, it's very hard emotionally to let go of that. So I think one of the skills mentally is being able to adapt and reset, which is not easy to do. We all have different emotions with different traumas that can create things like anxiety. It can even create some depression. And so being mindful of that, and I guess if you can get good diagnostics and work out how long would this process to get better take, and be reasonable in your estimate, then that can give you a bit of confidence if you know it's not long term. If it is long term, then it's very helpful to know early on. Maybe you broke your femur and it's a 12-month recovery. It's pretty handy to know that straight up. And that's a bit of an extreme example, but a sprained ankle, garden variety, and if you're used to doing some rehab and you've been through injuries, that might be a 3-week problem, not so mentally tough to deal with. And then you're going, well, what can I do? If I can't do X, what are my other options that I can do to make some progress? What can I do each day to make the injury get better as fast as physiology will let it? If you overdo it, you can make it go slower, but you can't beat the pace of natural healing. So it's just understanding that process and going, how can I help you be empowered to speed it up as much as your body will let it?
What are some of the things that you do with patients that help that process?
Um, I guess you're getting into the big management side, and I kind of divide it. If we put diagnostics is a really key part, but if you divide it into manual therapy or manual medicine, if you like, and you divide it into exercise therapy, and you're trying to work out with manual therapy if you have some roadblocks to you getting better. So let's say you're dealing with a hip problem, and one of the parts is you've got a weak gluteal muscle, and I'm sure most athletes out there have heard about weak gluteals. It's a very common thing to be thrown at. Or maybe a tight hamstring. They're two super common things. So one of the jobs is to go, is there something that's inhibiting the gluteals from contracting normally? Okay. Is there some sort of dysfunction that is holding you back? And that's one of the concepts with chronic pain or your gradual onset things is dysfunction. That's where something's not working right, but it's not structurally broken and showing up on your scan. Okay. So it might be that your nerve's irritated and it's not allowing your glute to function properly. Maybe the artery's irritated and your blood flow to the glutes a little bit less. Maybe one of your joints is irritated and that's inhibiting the gluteal. And we know that happens if your joint's inflamed. So can we do something about those issues? And it's just diagnostically working out, is it one of those? Is it 2 of them? Is it 10 of them? And treating them. And then you can sort of go into the exercise side and go, okay, if weakness is a problem, can we do a strength exercise for the gluteals? One of the 2 big mistakes I think that happen in my profession with that is you don't remove the inhibition on the muscle that you're trying to get working again. Okay, because it's very hard to say to someone, contract your glute, but your nervous system is kind of holding you back a bit. So if you can make it easy to contract, you're going to go a bit better. And the second big mistake is if I say glutes to you and you think, what pops into your mind as a strength exercise? Are there some exercises that jump to mind quickly? If I said, give me a glute exercise, I'm sure you could all think of a couple.
Mm-hmm.
Glute bridges.
Yeah.
Glute bridges. You could be thinking squats, Romanian deadlifts. You could be thinking lots of things. But the thing I think that matters, I call it load matching. So if you're asking a really high load exercise, maybe it's a single leg deadlift and you're going, hey, we're really going to hit these glutes, but your glute is quite a bit weaker. Your glute's looking at it going, Dave, I can't do that. I'm out. And you compensates and the hamstring kicks in or your back kicks in or something else does it. And you're trying to get the glute to work, but it won't contract because the load is too hard.
So would you then ask somebody to do like, instead of single leg deadlifts, you would take it down maybe to the floor and do like double legs down, glute bridges, and build from there towards like single leg glute bridge, and then bring the person up and doing again with both feet down and doing deadlifts and just to progress that way? Or
That's the principle, yeah. So the first thing that you do in the clinic is you observe and you go, a well-developed muscle. I always think Arnold Schwarzenegger bodybuilder, right? There's muscles bulging outwards everywhere. But if you're seeing muscles go the other way and they're caving in, that's not a normal athletic muscle, right? It's atrophied. And particularly, let's say we're talking glutes still, we've got these giant quads that are really athletic and they're bulging outwards and they look great. The glutes should match that. The hamstrings, the calves should match that in a lower limb athlete. But if you've got these giant quads and nothing else, you're going, hang on, something's not right here. Chances of doing full load quad is pretty high, but a full load glute might not be so high because it's not as well developed. So the first clue is just a visual look. And then based on what you're seeing, and maybe you've watched the walk, run, or do some movements, so could have watched a one or a two-legged squat. And there's a couple of tests. There's a squat test that we do clinically that you do about 5 of them on one leg, and it gets graded according to whether you can hold your body straight, your hips straight, your knees straight, your shoulders straight. And it's a quick test, and it says glutes are highly likely to be a problem or glutes are low on the priority list. And we need fairly quick tests because if we were testing every muscle ad nauseum, you'd be in the clinic forever. We'd never get to treating it. And so then you work out, okay, am I at a lower load, which could be, I think of low load for a glute as lifting the weight of your leg, which is about 15% body weight. So that's quite low. And it's not adequate for a runner or a cyclist for that matter, but you might be building some sets and reps. And then you go on to exactly what you're saying. Can I manage half my body weight on each leg, like a 2-leg drill, like a squat or a glute bridge, hip thruster type thing? And then can I progress it up to one leg?
As you're talking about these glute exercises, and probably they're a fundamental it's a fundamental mover, a fundamental muscle and whatnot that's in many of these sports that you specialize in, maybe with the exception of swimming. But some of the exercises that we've got in our Athletica platform, I think are on they're on page in terms of assisting our athletes in achieving conditioning and those muscles. Ones would be, are you familiar with 7-way hips?
Yeah, reasonably. I think they're more lifting the weight of the leg type exercises rather than the weight standing on your feet type exercise.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. So would you say that's appropriate or not really appropriate in the context that you're talking about?
It could be totally appropriate. I think it comes back to the load match. So what I would look for in the clinic would be if we want, this muscle to contract, does it contract well, or is it sort of not at all, or just half? I want a strong contraction. So if they're doing that exercise, they put their hand on their hip muscle and they go, yeah, the correct muscle's working good, then it's a good exercise for them. And it's a bit different for everyone. So some people are quite weak and have a lot of trouble getting muscles going. And so what looks like a good muscle for one of us might actually, good exercise, may not be good exercise for everyone. And so it's just a case of put your hand on the muscle. Is it doing what you want it to do? And if it is, excellent exercise. If it's not, or you're twisting your back because you can't move through the range of movement or that sort of thing, then probably not as good.
What are the primary risk factors for injuries in aging endurance athletes, specifically like cyclists, triathletes, runners, swimmers, and how can they mitigate the risks?
Well, the number one risk factor for injury across my whole time in the profession is, have you done an injury before? So prior history of injury is number one. So if you've torn that hamstring before, that's a bigger risk factor than any other single thing we can throw at it. And then after that, the research waters are a little bit muddier because you've got to throw a blanket over an enormous number of athletes, measure an enormous number of possible things like calf flexibility, calf strength, and so on and so forth. So to actually get a cut and dry answer on that is not easy. So consistent things that you could look for in yourself would be, is there areas of tightness or inflexibility like your calf? Or if you're a swimmer, in your shoulders? You might notice that by, can I get my hands up? And I'm not very good at a streamline position, but if a swimmer can't hit streamline, they're probably going to struggle to swim well, and they're going to have a lot more pressure on shoulders, maybe their spine, maybe a higher injury risk. So you have to put it in the context. And I think to be certain, you have to be individual. There's plenty of stories of people making small changes in their technique, whether it's a runner, someone in a throwing sport that has helped with injury. But I think contextually, you look at strength is probably your number one thing. As you get older, you lose your strength quicker. It's harder to get it back. It's better to maintain it, and you're going to go better if you can keep a certain level of strength. So that would be what I would look for.
David, what's the impact of stress and just stress in various different forms on injury occurrence? And I think you kind of answered it there with Paul. And I was kind of also like reflecting on my own like major injuries, and the big one for me would be a skiing injury as an ACL, where I tore an ACL on a turn that I kind of couldn't pull out of. But it wasn't like, and you'd think, oh, it's just at first glance you think it's just the turning out and the conditions and whatnot that caused that. But if I'm to backtrack a little bit more, there were so many other confounders to that day. We started out at, backcountry skiing at 4 a.m. in the morning. So we were tired. There was loads of stress going on in my own life, in my own world. And a day or two before, I had basically witnessed a class 2 avalanche that, it was basically, I just watched it kind of happen nearby. So psychologically, I was very stressed in that moment. So there are all these various different factors that when it kind of came down to it, there was just so much stress in the body. And it wasn't just the turn kind of out of that. It was the turn plus all these other various different factors that actually caused the major, massive injury to kind of, ultimately a massive mistake on my part that I really regret to this day, kind of thing. So it's interesting how these injuries actually manifest sometimes, these big ones.
Yeah, you made me think when you were talking about that. A long time ago, they did a lot of research on when do you get injuries and fatigue, whether stress is creating the fatigue, or cross-country skiing since 4 a.m. and there's different ways you can get fatigue, but most injuries happen at the start of a half or the end of a half if you're in a team sport, if you're at work at the start of the shift or the end of the shift. So in other words, before you're properly warmed up or when fatigue is setting in, you're much more likely to get hurt. So it's probably a good reminder if you're doing higher risk things, maybe you're in the gym and you're lifting weights, a good warm-up's important. Maybe if you're doing high intensity work, whichever format, particularly running, a good warm-up is worthwhile so that you minimize the risk of injury at the start of your workout. And then if you're getting really fatigued, maybe you modify the workout. Do you put a bit more rest in? Do you shorten it? Do you go into a lower risk activity if you're worried about crashing or twisting your knee or whatever it might be? So I would look at it that way.
Yeah. And David, with back to chronic pain, I interviewed it was Scotty Livingston and Leave Your Mark podcast and the Training Science podcast. We were speaking, and he's kind of this. He really talks a lot about the importance of our perception of threat in any one kind of condition. And I know we spoke on it briefly, I think, in the Training Science podcast as well that we did. But maybe I just find it so interesting if the general concept as I kind of understand it is that somehow that brain, your brain, is sometimes feeling threat because let's use my context where I've got an ACL injury. I'll it's rehab now and it's I've had surgery and all that sort of things, but I've always sort of got that in there. And even though that's it should all be good in there, there's something in my brain that still can feel threat around the area. And I'm sure maybe others would know that as well or have that common experience. Do you want to riff on that at all?
I think the first thing is after a reconstruction like that. I've had a shoulder reconstruction many years ago, and it's good surgery, did good rehab. It doesn't feel exactly the same. The architecture of your ligament, the tendon they put in is different to the ligament, all these little things, and your brain at some level perceives that. They're like for a shoulder in my context, going back here is quite a dangerous position. And so I've avoided that. Unfortunately, I wasn't in a throwing sport or something that required me to do that. But I would still avoid that to this day. And I would know, like a social context, if you're going swimming at the beach in Australia, and if you're catching a wave and you're surfing along and you get dumped, then you've got to pull your arm in, because if my arm stays out, I would have that same sensation you're having of threat and insecurity. I think the way that you mitigate that is through your physical preparation. Like if you're doing good rehab and you're working on the muscle activation and you're sidestepping and the various movements, if it's in a skiing context, maybe you're in a team sport context, you've got to sidestep. Maybe it's a collision sport where you've got to tackle people. You have to do quite a lot of rehab, and you build the confidence step by step. And as you build the confidence, your perception of threat goes down and you feel more confident doing more things. But it's not an overnight, it's not what I call a light switch fix, where you flick the light switch from on to off. It doesn't work that way. You've got to achieve it gradually and steadily, and that is very helpful. But I don't know that anyone says it feels perfect ever again. It feels a different knee, a new knee, but a good knee nonetheless.
So I wonder, as we age and an endurance athlete, we keep repeating the same motion. It's always this way, like running, biking, swimming. And especially like women in perimenopause, our ligaments start to become like old rubber bands, right? And if we don't we forget to have fun. I see this is with all my athletes. We forget to have fun and we just focus on this motion. We never go this way. We don't climb or balance, balance. So I'm always trying to get my athletes to play a little, because I've noticed in my own body that I get stiffer and stiffer every year.
I'm really glad you brought this up. I think for runners, I was at a conference, it was a sports podiatry conference probably a decade ago, and it was a great conference because it was quite informal and there was quite a lot of roundtable discussion. And one of the things that came up on running in particular was, statistically speaking in the research, it is safer to play rugby league or rugby union. You get less injured than if you're a runner. And we're all going, I don't believe that. I just cannot for the life of me understand how that's possible. But pretty much every study said the most injured group on the planet was endurance or long distance runners. And we got thinking about this for a long while, and I think someone hit the nail on the head when they said, and it's a one word answer, what do runners do? Runs.
Yeah.
Just flexion extension, front, back. There is no rotation. There is no lateral movement. Most of us runners won't do technical skills work. Because running fast and running well is a really high skill activity. And if I put my coach's hat on, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the three determinants of performance of VO2 max, your threshold or critical power or fractional utilization, whatever word you want to call it. And what's the third one?
Economy.
Now, economy, we know in running, if you're running faster, you hit the ground harder and you spend less time on the ground. If your foot spent more time on the ground, you'd be going slower, wouldn't you? So you've got this, if you're going to go faster, you're going to have to hit the ground harder, which is more force, which is a strength thing. And if you're doing it faster, that's a power thing. Speed, strength by speed is power. So if you're not doing some strength training and you're training those attributes, and your economy is also the technique, am I efficient in my running movement? Am I getting my arms working right? All of that. I think it's unrealistic as a runner to go, well, out of the three big things that are going to help me, I'm just going to cross one off the list. I'm never going to do that stuff.
Yeah, I noticed when I did an ultra, and it was very there was twists and turns. Sounds like whole body workout. Like I was sore in my upper body. I'm like, what? But we forget to train athleticism and agility like we were when we were younger, or how we coach younger athletes. When we turn 40, it's downhill, but we just keep singular-minded thinking about VO2 max, and I think we're missing the point there. We want, especially after 40, we need to play and challenge our agility and ability to move so that we don't grow old and slow. That's my theory anyways. But
it's part of the all-round athletic development. It's not just one bit that you're doing. You're trying to be a reasonable all-round athlete, even if you don't need to be the fastest side stepper in the world to run marathons. A little bit is a good thing.
Yeah.
And if sorry to put my Athletica hat on, it's been on the whole time, but the strength and conditioning sessions that we talked in there, just to David's point, with the importance of running economy, we've got jump landing that's in there, side hops, side to side, forward and back. And we do try to have at least, hitting your plyometric exercise twice per week in the gym. And then even we call it a strength endurance session on the run. But the idea being that you want to run up and down hills because you get some of that stretch shortening cycling, from the muscle contraction going on more so than just a flat run kind of run and whatnot. So just to kind of just to say we're Athletica users, listeners, we're trying to tick that box that David just mentioned there.
And you can add those ABCs and little drills as you're running warm up, walk a little and then do some skips, and then you run if you want to save some time.
I was going to say the warm up is a really rich place to put in something you need to work on. So if you've got a running technique issue, maybe it's your swing phase drive and you're doing those A skips, do them in your warm up for your run. If you are doing some rehab on a particular injury and there's some key exercises, maybe it's for your calf muscle, do them at the start and use it as part of your warm up and get it in there, and then do your run or do your ride or your swim. It's a really good spot that doesn't cost you time. You're going to warm up anyway. Why not use it to work on that economy aspect? Because you're doing it anyhow. You may as well do it with a purpose.
Yeah, and I think if you pay attention how your body feels, once you start doing those warm-ups, you notice how your technique actually is so much more efficient. You're running, it feels better.
It's like a primer.
Yeah, totally.
Priming the movement pattern you're seeking to improve on. Even if it fatigues over the course of the run, hopefully you can hold it a bit longer next time and a bit longer next week until it becomes stored in the central computer up here.
Mm-hmm. I found I've been thinking also about your thoughts here, David, and I'm kind of reflecting back to another podcast that I did a long while back, training science podcast with Professor Peter Wayan, and he's kind of like the godfather of the anaerobic speed and power reserve. And when he was on the podcast, he likened almost like the run connection phase to like similar to like Muhammad Ali when he's hitting a competitor as a punch, right? It's like you're making a punch to the ground, like, and it's actually that connection. You actually don't have to be like a George Foreman kind of thing. You can be that way with just like super powerful and whatnot with lots of muscle mass behind, but you can actually be a little bit more like Muhammad Ali and like, was it moves like a butterfly and stings like a bee, and it's like actually like Carl Lewis was notorious for this. Peter Wan was saying he actually wasn't that strong in the gym. In fact, you'd be amazed at how weak he was. Of course, he was the first guy under 10 seconds for the 100. What he perfected was what you're kind of describing with his technique and how he laid a punch to the ground with his lower limbs. And that was what kind of made him so effective and so efficient, so economical. And that's what we want to work towards, that if we want to be amazing runners.
David and Paul, when you guys were discussing on your on Paul's podcast about some of the chronic pain, and you talked about, and I'm going to forget what it's exactly, but you talked about a hip situation, and I have a athlete that I work with who has had a niggle in her hip, has had pain, and she kept ignoring it, and now it's a chronic pain situation, and it's debilitating, and it's one of those non-specific pains. There's nothing in the MRI or X-ray that shows up. You two talked about something perhaps with fascia, and what are your next steps with this kind of athlete? I mean, what do you do? Do you start manipulating? Do you start? I mean, how do you go from a niggle that's now a pain to fixing that? And there's nothing specific there.
And maybe start, David. I loved how you described fascia. Tell everyone what fascia is first, and then get to Paul's question. Yeah, because it's an interesting one. Not everyone would know about it.
Yeah, fascia is a really interesting structure, and it envelops everything in the body. So the easiest way that everyone will know is if you've got a joint of roast beef that you're going to cook for dinner, it's the white shiny stuff around the red meat is one type of fascia. So everyone's got that picture in their mind. So every muscle in the body is covered in fascia, every artery, nerve, lymphatic or venous vessel, even your bones have a covering around them. So it pretty much covers everything. And if you look at it on that joint of roast beef, everything's interconnected. So all of this fascia interconnects through the body. And like every structure in the body, there are nerve receptors in the fascia that sense what's going on, because that's how our body gets the feedback to adapt. So if we want to run and we want things to get stronger, we need a way of sensing that input, that impact load, the stretch, the contraction, whatever it is. And one of the ways, in that neuromuscular system is these sensory receptors, and that might potentially give us a way of saying, hey, we need to upregulate this to make it stronger, better bone density, thicker tendon, whatever it might be. Now, within the fascia is a structure called the fibroblast. It's a little cell that makes the white collagen fibers that you saw on the roast meat. And those fibroblasts have been shown to respond to mechanical stretch, like stretching things. So if you put load into that fascial structure around the artery, the nerve, the muscle, whatever structure it is, they're going to detect what's going on. So one of the ways that this could go wrong in terms of developing pain in a hip, and there's probably a chronic load thing, which would be a postural overload of that fascia, or maybe they're on the bike and their handlebars are too low and their torso is coming down and closing the hip angle up and it's pinching at the front. So it's a repetitive motion thing. Or it might have been we jerked our hip in some sort of movement, like instead of twisting the knee when Paul was skiing, or maybe you slipped on wet ground, you twisted the hip a little bit. And those cells sensed it and they went, bang, I've got to protect whatever it is I thought was getting injured, the muscle, the joint, the nerve, whatever it was. And so they convert to what's called a myofibroblast, which introduces tension in that fascia. And that traps inflammatory cytokines, which are the chemicals that cause inflammation. And if nothing gets those cells to relax and the fascia to relax, that keeps the inflammatory cytokines there, which perpetuates the inflammation. And that's known as peripherally maintained pain. That's why the niggle stays until we do something to get the fascia and those cells to let go and allow the structures, whatever it is, the nerve, the muscle, the fascia, to move better so that it's not surrounded in inflammation. That is a really hard concept. It's about a 28-page paper I've tried to summarize. But it's a tough one to get your head around. But imagine that you just can't get the inflammatory chemicals out once things are locked. Most of my patients will say, I've locked it up. I've locked my neck up. I've locked my back up, my hip up, whatever it is. And people, that's that tightness we were talking about before, Mariana. Something's not quite right. May not hurt yet. But if I keep loading that structure, one of two things happens. Either it does get sore, or I compensate for it higher up the kinetic chain and I start locking other stuff up. And the last thing left moving starts hurting. So the diagnostics for that, I'm assuming cyclist, Paul, would be, is it a bike fit issue or is it the rider? And then if it's the rider, where in the kinetic chain is locked up? So the sort of thing that we do now is we would motion test everything, obviously the hip and the lower extremity, but we might look at all of the different spinal levels from the top of the head down to the tip of the tailbone and go, what's locked up? Because if you're sitting on a bike and you're sitting crooked, because my neck's crooked, maybe my shoulders are that way, my hips are that way, and it's down the chain that's the problem. And I won't know that until you have a look and you go, maybe you get in there and you go, oh, it's just, L3, L4, that innovation area of the hip's the problem, but maybe it's not. Maybe they're under load from elsewhere. And so it just depends where the restriction is. And then you go, okay, if it is L3, 4, is it sympathetic nerve, or is L3, 4 locked up because the hip's irritated and the labrum reacted, or the hip flexor reacted? And so you're just looking at what are all those possibilities and trying to problem solve it. And typically with the more chronic pain, if it's one of these, I've just locked myself up, there's a whole list of them. Your body handles one little thing pretty good, but if you've got 20, 50, 100 things, my term for it is death by 1,000 paper cuts. One paper cut's not a big problem, but after 1,000 of them, you start bleeding out and you've got a problem. And most people get that. So you're looking for these little things and trying to work out what's the most primary, what's secondary, and you treat the primary ones as best you can tell first. And we've got some ways of doing or testing for that now that we didn't have 10 years ago. And we're starting to develop that. Is it perfect yet? Probably not, but it's better than it was, and it's getting better all the time.
Yeah.
So, David, we've talked a lot about manipulation. We've talked about a lot about things that you do as a physiotherapist. What about strength training? Is it better to strength train specifically for a sport, for the movements of a sport, or is it better to do a full body kind of workout, or kind of a combination of what, in order to prevent injury?
I think there's a little bit of a training history or age dependence there. So with young athletes, I always think long-term athlete development, all-round athlete, and that takes a couple of years in the gym, just very gently learning how to move and allowing, particularly adolescents, their bones and their discs and tendons to tolerate that load and adapt. So you don't need to do anything heavy when they start. If you've got a big training history behind you and lots of years in the gym, you might be doing it somewhat differently. A lot of the strength coaches where I work anyway will say it's about a 10-year process to build a great athlete in the gym, and from there on in it's maintenance. So if you started when you're 15 and you've done a couple of years of adapting and you're probably reaching a peak maybe when you say mid-20s, after that they're often lifting to maintain that rather than, the sky's not the limit. You just can't keep going to infinity and beyond with these things. So what you may need to do in the gym might be a little bit different. In terms of sport specific, I don't particularly like sport specific straight up. And Mariana was already talking about that, just running flex extend, same with cycling. You lose all of this stuff laterally or rotational wise. If you're a lower body athlete, you only lift your lower body, the top half withers away, and we got this imbalance between the top and the bottom. I'm not saying your top half has to be amazing as a runner compared to your bottom half, but I think you need a little bit of something. So I would tend to steer towards a little bit more of an overall program. The bias might be towards your legs if you're a runner and a cyclist rather than towards your arms. But I think totally neglecting half of your body in the gym's probably, first of all, you're not going to be able to squat very well without some strength in your back and shoulders, right? But and it's going to ultimately impair that sport specific, but your bias might be a bit different because your context is specific to lower body rather than, say, an upper body sport like shot putting.
Yeah. If you could give one piece of advice to an aging endurance athlete who is worried about injury, what would it be?
Don't just run. A little bit of technique work in your warm-up, maybe a little bit of strength work. Do things that aren't just legs, flexion, extension. Do some other stuff. Have some fun with it and embrace the variety, and you'll probably find you go a lot better. You'll be a little punchier, a little quicker, a little less injured, having a good time. It's not going to harm your performance one bit. It's probably actually going to help.
Well, David, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
That is all for this week. Join us next week on the Athletes Compass podcast. Ask your training questions in the comments or on our social media. When you finish this episode and love it, we appreciate it when you take a moment to give us a 5-star review. For more information or to schedule a consultation with Paul, Mariana, or myself, check the links in the show notes. For David Wadsworth, Mariana Rakai, and Dr. Paul Larson, I'm Paul Worlowski, and this has been the Athletes Compass Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Athletes Compass Podcast, your North Star through the sometimes complicated world of training for your endurance sport. We appreciate your comments and training questions and your 5-star reviews. For a deeper dive into the science of endurance sports, listen to the Training Science Podcast and check out the adaptive AI training platform Athletica.ai. Thanks for listening.